My name is Denny Henson, and I am here today interviewing William or Bill MacKinnon as part of the Utah Humanities Grant titled New Tales for Old Trails to Utah, Oral Histories by the People Who Discovered Them. Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025, and we're recording this oral history using Zoom. Bill's located in Montecito, California, and I am in Linden, Utah. So, Bill, thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure, Denny.
Well, you've talked about your methods and let's see, and how you it says that you got access to the Brigham Young papers that were reportedly locked. So this is always fascinating. How do certain historians get access to certain records when others are not? How did that come about in your case?
Well, I don't know that I got any special access, but one of the things that helped me tremendously, I mentioned that I used two document scouts, Bagley and Artist Partial, over the years to extend my own reach geographically as well as culturally. Artist, before she became a genealogist and a historian, was a legal secretary. And legal secretaries in the old days of typewriters and stenographic records were at the top of the pyramid. I mean, they were the best of the best because everything they did had to be 100% for legal reasons.
Right.
So she had terrific transcription skills. And artists would take her laptop to the church archives, and were, in many cases, their rules precluded making photocopies of documents or microfilms, but they had no objection to people reading the documents and making notes of them. And in Artist's case, she would make notes of things she was reading for me on her laptop, and she was such a good transcriber that in a lot of cases, she came back with the entire text of the document. I mean, it was the next best thing to a photocopy. And so some of the access I got wasn't special access, but it was different access in the sense of the person that was helping me had this skill. I mean, artists made transcriptions of thousands of documents. I mean, before the Brigham Young collection was available on microfilm, it was open to research, but just no photocopies. And she transcribed thousands of pages of Brigham Young letters. I mean, she probably knows more about what's in those records than most of the archivists that work for the church, who are the keepers of the documents. So that helped me a lot in the Brigham Young material. What the material I really wanted to get into, but wasn't able to for years, was the Thomas L. Kane collection that the Lee Library at BYU acquired, and David Whitaker bought it. And the collection was so massive that it took years to properly catalog and file it and make it available for use. And so I don't know, say it took 5 years or something like that to catalog. I desperately wanted to use it, but David wouldn't let me use it because, nobody could use it. He had to catalog it first. So I remember visiting him one day in Provo, and we got to talking about what he'd acquired from the Kane family. And he said, there it is. And in the corner of his office, there were like 9 banker's boxes bulging with Thomas L. Kane records. I mean, I had this urge to go over and rip open a carton. I had to restrain myself. So I had to wait until he got finished cataloging. And then when it was thrown open to the public, Artist in her laptop went to Provo to go through it. But before that happened, what I came to realize by reading again, other people's footnotes and bibliographies, I realized that in the 1930s and 40s, a church member who was very interested in history named Frank Evans helped survey a lot of the records that the Kane family had in Pennsylvania that Dave Whitaker bought for BYU decades later. And Frank Evans also transcribed, not on a computer laptop because they hadn't been invented, but in handwriting or maybe with a typewriter. The Kane family members let him transcribe some of this material, and so I knew that there was a Frank Evans collection at Church Archives that contained transcripts of Kane materials that BYU eventually bought. So even before the BYU materials, the originals were available, I was able to access some of the documents by using the Evans transcripts for the 1930s. That was sort of an unusual access to a collection that I wanted to get into, but that was embargoed for years, just because the sheer enormity of it made it unwieldy and difficult for people to use. So they weren't available to the public when a lot of the public, like me, wanted to be able to use it.
So can you give us an example of these two collections, something that you found in there that you were excited to find?
Lots of things.
Like how important were they?
It wasn't just in those collections. I mean, the thing I get the biggest kick out of, Denny, is not handling the documents. I mean, I'm not a collector of documents. I do collect some books because it's the only place I can find certain things. But in terms of the documents themselves, I'm not a collector. I don't want to own and stash away letters and diaries, but I want to read them and use the substance of it. So what gives me a big kick is not handling the documents and saying, gee, Thomas L. Kane held this thing up 150 years ago, but it's understanding for the first time that anybody has been able to understand what he was doing and why. So coming across these discoveries are what excite and interests me, because it's new knowledge. Like the dispatches from the British ambassador to Washington in 1857-58, that went back to London, to realize that those existed and where they were and be able to read them. That was a tremendous kick for me.
Goosebumps.
Yeah, right. And I mean, that story is so complicated that it could be the subject of an article in and of itself. But and then there were other mysteries. Like I knew that there was a single Marine Corps lieutenant involved in the Utah expedition because of rumors at the headquarters of the Marine Corps at the Washington Navy Yard. There were rumors around that a single lieutenant was out in Utah with the Army for this campaign, and it was unique because this was not a naval campaign at all, except for the Colorado River part of it. But no one knew who this guy was, or what kind of records he kept or was sending back to Washington, because no one could find out anything about him because they didn't know his name. And the curator of the Yale Western Americana collection, when I was a student and he became a friend after I graduated in 1960, he was a Marine reservist. He'd been in World War II in the Marine Corps and stayed in the reserves. And so he would spend part of each summer down at the Washington Navy Yard at Marine Corps headquarters. And he told me one day that the commandant would buttonhole him every year when he saw him in the hall and say, Captain Hanna, did you ever figure out who that Marine officer was that was in Utah in the 1850s? And Hanna would have to say, no, sir, I don't, but I'll try to find it. He never did. But he told me this story. It was kind of a funny. It was one of his great professional challenges in a way. I mean, so I knew that there was such a person, and I knew that the Marine Corps was interested, but I knew they were up a tree, as was the curator, because they had no name. Well, fast forward 20 or 30 years, and one night in I suppose it was the 1990s, I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep. So I went downstairs and wandered through my library looking for something to read. And I pulled out a little volume that I'd bought on the antiquarian book market 10 years earlier. And it was the reminiscences of a civilian who accompanied the 7th Regiment of infantry around the West for years. He was sort of a merchant who supplied the soldiers with needles and thread and canned sardines and things of that sort. He never was in uniform. He never was formally in the military, but he was of the military because he followed this regiment for years. And so I had never really read the book. I was interested in it, and I bought it, but I hadn't gotten around to reading it. So I fished it off the shelf. It's probably 100 pages long, and leafed through it. And on one page, this civilian accompanying the army in the field is describing a buffalo hunt. And in describing the officers chasing on horseback this herd of buffalo that surrounded the regiment, he made the comment that Lieutenant Browning of the Marine Corps almost got gored to death by a buffalo, and his horse was gored and died. And it was quite a scene. And a big neon sign went off in my mind that said, bingo. I mean, Lieutenant Browning of the Marine Corps. So I now had a name. And I was able to fish out his records and the reports that he sent back from Utah to the Marine Corps in Washington about what he was doing. He was attached to the 5th Regiment of Infantry, an Army regiment. That's what he went west with. And I even found a daguerreotype that was taken of him in uniform, and that's in volume. I forget if it's in volume 1 or volume 2 of That Sword's Point, but it's a photograph of Browning. So not only was I able to identify him through that serendipitous process at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I also years later, found a photograph of him on the internet.
Wow.
So
Were you ever able to share that with your friend? Was your friend
no,
still involved?
he had passed away by that time, unfortunately. But that's an example of a kick out of new knowledge, as opposed to the handling of an artifact, which doesn't do much for me, but the information does. So, but there have been dozens of those sorts of things in the course of this. So the documents, they either shed new light on something that I was unaware of, or they confirm a hunch or a suspicion that I had. And either way, it's a big positive when it happens.
Give you clues.
Yeah, the breadcrumbs.
Well, I won't ask you about the National Archives, though. I will. I'll ask, have you been to the National Archives?
Yeah, yes. When I worked in New York for 10 years, from 62 through 72, and before I was married, I spent a lot of Saturdays driving down to Washington to burrow through the National Archives of the Library of Congress.
So just tell us your impression of that. What is that experience? Was that like for you? Like the first time, probably. And
well, just
now your old hat.
Vast holdings of stuff. A lot of the archivists, the professionals, were very helpful people. I mean, great. Unfortunately, the Library of Congress was looted so badly that by the time I got down there to use it, to go into the manuscript reading room, you practically had to strip naked and wander in with a pencil. They wouldn't let you use a pen so everything, coats, laptops, everything, had to go into a locker before you could go into the reading room. And they'd give you a pad of blank paper and a pencil, and you could make notes on that. But they were burned so badly by document thieves that they buttoned the place down, but good. Yale became that way too, to a certain extent, for the same reason. But when I was an undergraduate, I had a stack pass that let me wander through the place at will. Nothing was off limits to an undergraduate. And I think because there's been so much pillaging and thievery, that's not the case any longer, which is too bad, because that was by the way, one of my little research techniques is I'd go pursue something that I was interested in, like Roy and Ann Hafen's book about the Utah expedition in 1958. I found that in the stacks. I mean, it's a beautiful book. It's available now only on the antiquarian book market for a couple $100. But then it was just in the stacks. I mean, this beautiful book that the Arthur H. Clarke Company had put out, but it wasn't in a locked case or a cage or anything like that. It was just in the open stacks available to undergraduates. And so I headed towards that one day. I found it in the card catalog, which again was mechanical. They were literally little cards in beautiful wooden rosewood filing cabinets. And I found it, and then I started looking around it. I'd wander through the shelves around it and come up with other stuff that I didn't even know existed. So that was a research methodology. It was kind of research by browsing in an open stack that isn't accessible anymore in that way.
Kind of window shopping.
Exactly. Yeah. I probably saw you there somewhere too, probably.
Well, you talked a little bit about some of the obstacles you had with being geographically further away from Utah and hiring people. And trying to get into some of these repositories with personality conflicts sometimes. What are some of the other obstacles that you've come across?
Trying to discover and discard the bogus material. I mean, the Mark Hoffman incident in the 1980s raised questions about a lot of materials. I mean, anything that the LDS Church had bought from Hoffman was tainted by this. Actually, some of the stuff Hoffman sold the church was legitimate, as I understand it, but some of it wasn't. It was bogus. He had forged it, manufactured it himself. And so I remember one set of diaries that was really relevant to what I was looking for, but the church had acquired it from Hoffman. And I just decided I wasn't going to take the chance of using it. I mean, it was one of these, if it's too good to be true, it may not be. So I just passed it by. I later discovered that it was legitimate, that it wasn't bogus, that I could have used it, should have used it probably. But at the time I discarded it because it was tainted by association with him. There were other people, Denny, who as the war became more colorful and better known, created a role for themselves in it that didn't exist. For example, in the middle of the campaign, because the Army had lost so many horses, mules, and oxen, it sent one of its captains, Captain Marcy, south from Fort Bridger to Taos, New Mexico, to come back with 1,000 mules and horses to repower the Utah expedition. I mean, it lost thousands of animals in the snowstorms of November 1857 in the Rockies. And it couldn't move on the South Salt Lake Valley in the spring of 1858 until it had replacement animals. So Marcy and a detachment of 60 or so people went down the spine of the Continental Divide with no trail in the dead of winter to get to New Mexico. And it was a near-death experience for those people. I mean, they almost all died. As it turned out, only one did, a sergeant who gorged himself to death once they got to New Mexico. But after the Utah War, when Marcy wrote a book about his experiences on this trek, it was the most arduous winter march in American military history until the Korean War. A lot of people put out articles and books saying they'd been along with him and they had done these magnificent feats of daring do with Captain Marcy. And most of those weren't true. They were bogus, that somebody made them up to kind of burnish their own military record. And I was able to determine that. I mean, I found a list of people that were with him, and these people weren't on the list. And I went back to their regiment's monthly returns to see if they were present at Fort Bridger when Marcy went to Mexico, or whether they were absent on detached duty. And they were still at Fort Bridger when he was in New Mexico. So I was able to tease out of all that, I was able to separate the wheat from the chaff. But that took time and some energy to that. So one of the obstacles was that this was such in the 1860s and 70s, this was such an interesting adventure that a lot of people wanted to be part of it, even though they weren't. And to figure out what I could use as legitimate and what wasn't legitimate constituted kind of an obstacle.
So can I ask you a question about that then?
Yeah.
So what methodologies do you use to finally determine if they're legitimate or not? Documents, records per se.
Well, in one case, when Marcy was sent from Fort Bridger to New Mexico to buy these animals, there was an order drawn up at Fort Bridger and given to him, instructing him on what he was to do, what kind of animals did they need, how many, how is he going to pay for them, that sort of thing. And it had in that order a list of each of the people that were going with him. So the first thing I would do, and that list has never been published. I'm finishing up an article that publishes the names of everybody that went with him, because they've never been published. But having the list, having found it, I could then compare those names with the bogus accounts and determine they were bogus because they weren't on the list. And then I would double check that by going back to the regiment that these claimants were in at that time to see whether they were listed as being present or absent. If they were present at Fort Bridger, I knew they hadn't gone with Marcy because they were still at Bridger. If they had been listed as missing on detached duty, then there would have been a question that, well, maybe they were with Marcy and for some reason they weren't on the other list. But that was my principal means of figuring out what was bogus and what was real.
And I think that your military history helped you with that, because you would have known how that worked, right? Orders and
right.
Records and where
you would have known that, on the last day of every second month, beginning in February, the Army everywhere stood muster and inspection, and there was a list of who was present and who was absent, and if they were absent, why. So knowing that happened, you could ferret out those documents with some effort to get at the issue of who was involved and who wasn't.
Wow. Very good. Well, so that you explained how you overcame those obstacles. Do you feel like your not being LDS has given you some advantages in this, trying to ferret out all of the information about this subject?
I think the answer is yes. And answering the question about whether not being LDS was an advantage or not, I think it helped in some ways, but in other ways it's hard to tell exactly how that worked. I think the thing that helped me the most, Denny, was I tried to be as fair and even-handed as I could, and let the chips fall where they may. Because I wasn't brought up in Utah and wasn't a member of the church and wasn't involved in the most controversial aspects of a lot of the church's early history, I came to the subject starting in the 1950s as kind of a blank slate. So I didn't have any background. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just had an assignment that interested me. And so I pursued it as best I could in an even-handed way. And I think that more than anything else helped me in terms of access. But probably on top of that, the fact that I was not a Latter-day Saint added a dimension to it that may have helped. And I'll explain it this way. A lot of the material that I used was pretty sensitive. I mean, it involved murder in some cases, corruption in other cases, and I tried to be careful in how to use that because this involved the reputation of people's ancestors and institutional reputation in some cases. At one point, as I said, except for the priest-penitent type of religious documents, nobody ever said, no, you can't see that. But some of it was pretty volatile. And at one point, I asked a couple of the archivists kind of, why are you letting me see this material? I mean, aren't you a little bit worried about how I'm going to use it? And the answer that I got in a couple of cases was, well, we've read the stuff you've been writing over the years, and you come across as being pretty even-handed, and so we're confident that you'll use it responsibly. And then the next thing they would say, which fascinated me, was they said, and we think it's time that this information surfaced. There's no reason in our mind that it shouldn't, but we'd rather have the surfacing be done by somebody who's not a member of the church. In other words, I wasn't jeopardizing my standing in the church at all by the material I was using and the way I was using it, because I wasn't a member. I didn't need a tempo recommend from my bishop. So they said, we'd rather have you surface this than have us try to, because we're so embedded in the system and the traditions that we think it would be more effective to have a non-member do this. So I did it. Now, not everybody would agree that I was fair and even-minded. I mean, I've had some people who've written, comments about books that show up on the websites, the Amazon.com websites that offer the books for sale, and they ask for reader comments, and maybe 3 or 4 people or 10 or 20 people will comment. And in those comments, there's always somebody that says, well, there's a lot of good information in here, but this guy's really got an axe to grind, I mean, so not everybody agrees with what I've done, but the thing that's helpful is a lot of people do. I mean, they say, the reaction is, gee, I didn't know that, or wow, or did this really happen that way? That type of thing. So I know to some extent, because I don't have the traditional baggage of being dipped by the heels in the Utah culture for my whole life. That's been viewed as helpful rather than a problem. It was a problem in the sense that I lacked background when I started. And it's where, again, my document scouts, Will Bagley and Artis Partial, helped mightily. They in effect conducted long distance tutorial and researching in these types of records, which I knew nothing about. I mean, eventually I traveled to Utah, and when Jeff Johnson was the Utah State archivist, I spent a lot of time with him and other people, and the directors of the Utah State Historical Society all became uh, great friends of mine. So as the years passed, I got to know more people and more insight myself into what happened. But artists in her magic laptop were of enormous help to me.
Sounds like it. Well, I think it's wonderful to have you being the person researching the topic. And so I think it's great.
Well, one of the things I've learned, especially artists, was very helpful in this, was that there's often two sides, at least two sides to some of these controversial issues. That's not the same thing as being, well, everybody's okay. I mean, because there are a lot of people involved. I mean,
Mm.
the fact that there are at least two or three sides to it doesn't absolve people who made tremendous mistakes and costly ones at that. It just means you have to try to understand what those other sides are.
It sounds like you're doing that just from the way you described the key players in this conflict. You gave us their good points, and you had areas that they needed and could have improved in. So I like that.
Well, there are a lot of people in the small James Buchanan community in Pennsylvania who probably aren't too wild about a lot of the things I've written, because I've been pretty direct about his shortcomings.
Well, and also I found in the foreword of part one of At Swords Point, Will Bagley says you were able to bring to life dozens of forgotten participants. And you've mentioned one of those, the Marine officer, right?
Yes, Robert Browning.
Yeah. Will you share one or another one maybe of who they are that you've discovered and how they impact the story? I'm especially interested if you found any women.
Yes, that was one of my other discoveries, is that not only was this not an all Army show. I mean, there was Lieutenant Browning for the Marine Corps along to leaven all that Army influence, but there were lots of women involved. I mean, in the case of the Latter-day Saint side, of course, the home front was only 113 miles west of Fort Bridger. So in the Mormon community, lots of women who were either daughters, wives, girlfriends, spouses of Navajo Legionnaires who were helping to support them. And I mean, there's some fun stories about the clothing that these ladies made for the Latter-day Saint troops. My favorite one, which I think Linda Carter, the late Linda Carter, supplied me with, involved a Navajo Legionnaire who went campaigning in Echo Canyon wearing an overcoat made out of his fiance's Irish bearskin rug. One of the prized possessions she brought over from Ireland and took across the plains was a bearskin rug, and that got made into a coat for this private in the Navajo Legion during the war. And there were other guys who went into battle wearing clothing made out of mattress ticking, and I mean, there were all kinds of things that were fashioned on the home front to support the troops.
Keep them warm.
Yeah. Um, one of the women that I've written about, and Devin Johnson on the staff at BYU has written even more than I have about this person. But one of his ancestors, or his wife's ancestors, I forget how the family tree runs, was a lady named Cynthia Stowell, Stowall, and her husband was a lieutenant in the Navajo Legion, captured on October 16th of 1857 around South Pass, but captured by the Army and kept captive during the whole winter. And that left Cynthia and one of her sister wives all alone no male in the family present, and they had between them 12 children, and she was pregnant with a 13th. And when the time came for the move south in March of 1858, she went to her bishop and asked, did she have to go south too under these circumstances? And he thought about it and he said, well, have the baby and then wait a week and then come. And that's what she did. And eventually the husband was released at the end of the campaign at Fort Bridger, and he went into Salt Lake City with the new governor, Alfred Covey. But Cynthia Stowell was south in Provo with this brood of 13 children, one of whom was still nursing. I mean, that's a story of hardship and tenacity and grit that you don't find in many other circumstances. And another woman that I came across who wasn't well known as being involved was a Shoshone lady. Some people have referred to her as a princess because I think her father or uncle was a chief. But her Anglo name, I don't know what her tribal name was, but her Anglo name was Jenny Goodale, Goodale. And her husband was a mountain man named Tim Goodale from upstate New York. And Tim went along with Captain Marcy to New Mexico to help guide him through the mountains as he trekked from Fort Bridger to Taos to buy these 1,000 Spanish mules to repower the Utah expedition. And Jenny, his wife, went with him. The only woman on that trek. The most arduous winter march in American military history. And one of the people along is a civilian woman, a Shoshone lady. And her pet pony was along with her. The pony got eaten finally when the Marcy expedition was desperate for food. They ate almost all their mules and Jenny Goodall's pony. Captain Marcy said, when we get to Taos, I'll buy you a new one, which he did. But her presence there wasn't known. In the order listing who was going with him, the civilians were just listed as a group. They weren't listed by name. The soldiers were all listed by name, but the civilian packers and mule skinners were just listed as a group. 20 mule skinners, that sort of thing. And Jenny was in that group.
How did you find her name then?
Well, Captain Marcy, wrote 4 or 5 different accounts of this trek over the years, and in one of them, in one sentence, he mentioned her name and told the story about the pony they had to eat and how he had to buy her a new one in Taos. I mean, that's the only record of her being along.
Wow.
And then there were other women. Most of the letters, many of the letters that the soldiers wrote have survived. They were preserved by the families back in Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. But the letters that the home front wrote to send to the Army people haven't survived. So there's almost no record of what the wives and daughters and girlfriends were writing to their U.S. Army connections who were involved in this campaign, except the letters written by the wife of Brevet Captain Marcus Reno have been preserved, and I printed some of those in the first volume of At Sword's Point. So her role and what she put up with during the campaign is now known in a way that it wouldn't have been otherwise. The most interesting document of a woman involved in all this, I think, was the one kept by Thomas L. Kane's wife, Elizabeth. He left to go to Utah in January of 1858, didn't come back until June. And meanwhile, she's living with his parents without any income to speak of while he's off gallivanting around doing the noble thing with Brigham Young, and she's in the home front with two very small children. And while he was gone, she celebrated her 22nd birthday. I mean, she was that young.
Oh, wow.
He was quite a bit older than she was, but what she wrote was invaluable because, again, it's another case of who was in the room. When her husband Thomas went to see Buchanan at Christmas time of 1857 to tell him he was thinking of going to Utah, Buchanan left no record of the visit. And Kane didn't leave much of one, but when he went back to suburban Philadelphia after going to the White House at Christmas time, 1857, he told his wife Elizabeth what had happened, and she wrote that down in her diary. So there's a record of Kane's visit to the president of sort of secondhand, but at least it's a record of some kind that wouldn't exist otherwise. Mm-hmm. So she's one of the people involved. So, and then there were hundreds of women at Fort Bridger during the winter of 1857-58 who were company laundresses for the Army. Army regulations permitted each company to have 4 laundresses who were considered part of the Army. They got Army rations, and the soldiers were required to pay them for doing their laundry. So there were dozens of these ladies. Some of them kept records, so we know of their existence in a way that wouldn't otherwise be the case. So it's bits and pieces, but if you're determined to find it and you look carefully, you'll find what was the role of women in this campaign, which is usually portrayed as being an all-male show. There were women involved, and in the case of Jenny Goodell on the trek to New Mexico with Captain Marcy, it was quite an adventure. She didn't leave a record of it, but we know what she went through because other people did leave one, and because of the mention of her by Marcy himself, we knew she was there.
She would have been going through the same thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So let's see if there's somebody else I can think of. The church archives have a number of diaries or letters written by women whose husbands were in the Army. One of the funniest ones, in a way, I wrote an article that came out in the Utah Historical Quarterly in I think it was around 2021. The title of the article was "Romantics on Horseback," and it's the story of the courtship and marriage in the middle of the Utah War of a young Nauvoo Legion private and his girlfriend. And her name was Eleanor Amelia Crosland, and his name was John T. McDonald. He was an Irish immigrant. And they met in the fall of 1857 while he was on military duty with the Nauvoo Legion in Echo Canyon. He came back and met her at her mother's home. And he struck up a relationship with her, and he was detailed when the move south took place. She went along with her mother to Pleasant Grove with a lot of people from northern Utah, and her fiance, John McDonald, a private in the Nauvoo Legion, was detailed to stay behind in Salt Lake City and burn the place if Brigham Young gave the order to do that if he thought the Army was misbehaving. So McDonald and Eleanor sort of saw each other surreptitiously while he's supposed to be on duty in Salt Lake City. And after a while, they decided that they were going to get married. They had one horse between them. It was her father's white horse. And they decided that one day when he got off duty and was riding down to Pleasant Grove with her, that they would get married. And they figured that the way they were going to do that was they knew there was a Nauvoo Legion colonel named Jesse C. Little on the state road between Salt Lake and Pleasant Grove with a herd of 300 dirty sheep and a couple of shepherds that were his nephews. And they knew he was on the road, and they figured we'll get Colonel Little to marry us. So they after John got through with his Navajo Legion duties for the day, he and Eleanor on this white horse galloped down the road, and they get to Jesse Crosby, who's punching these 300 dirty sheep along the road, and tell them they want to get married, and they realize that they can't do a sealing in the traditional way, but they'd at least like him to perform a civil service. So they officially married. And he said, well, I don't know. And they kept badgering him to the point. He said, oh, okay, all right, I'll do it. He said, get off the horse and we'll have the marriage ceremony here at the side of the road. And Eleanor Amelia Crosland says, get off the horse. We're not getting off the horse. and her husband later wrote down, she said to him that we've done all our sparking on this horse, and by God, we're going to get married on him too. So we're not getting down. And get on with it. So this colonel, he's a private in the Navajo Legion. She's a civilian who's his fiance, and this colonel, notwithstanding an exalted position in the Navajo Legion, is still acting as shepherd to these animals. He says, "Oh, okay, I'll do it." So he marries them. They're still on horseback. He finishes the service, wishes them well, and they gallop off to Pleasant Grove. And 5 o'clock the next morning, he gets up and rides back to Salt Lake City to finish out his Navajo Legion thing. Well, he left an account of this. So when he died in 1909, his kids gave it to the Deseret News, and it was published in the Deseret News, I think, in 1909. And it's this wonderful story of romance in the middle of war involving two plucky young people in their early 20s, probably. I mean, most of the stories about marriage in Utah are these sort of dreadful polygamy stories of 75-year-old elders running after nubile 16-year-old girls who don't want to get married, and they get forced into it, and it's awful and miserable. And it wasn't that way for a lot of people, including John McDonald and Eleanor Crosland. Well, there's a woman involved in the Utah War in a way that you normally don't come across. So anyway, that became the heart of an article that Holly George published in the Utah Historical Quarterly. The two of them, after the war was over, went into the candy business and created a highly successful candy company. Salt Lakers probably remember it as the McDonald Candy Chocolate Company or something like that. I mean, it became nationally known as once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, they could get sugar and caramel and other ingredients from the East Coast, and they created this wonderful candy company in the middle of Salt Lake City after the war was over.
That is great. That is a great story. Well, why don't you tell us, I think it's interesting that you have been the president of the Mormon History Association. What are some of the things that you've accomplished during that period that you're proud of?
I'd say my major accomplishment was bringing order and clarity to a situation that was loaded with ambiguity and ineffectiveness. I, as president, did not accomplish grand things in the sweep of Mormon history. I continued to write my own stuff, but I didn't quarterback a task force on revising Mormon history or creating the new Mormon history. Or I didn't accomplish something that was really historical, but it dealt with the organization itself. I didn't know that when I became president. This was a surprise to me, but the place needed a lot of work and a lot of things done differently, and that's what I spent my time on. So it was to bring clarity and orderliness to a situation that was anything but, and I think that helped it. MHA has gone through a couple of traumatic periods, especially right after the conference in Denmark in the year 2000. It was almost broke and really in dire straits. And I went on the council, which was the predecessor to the board, for 3 years shortly after that time. So I saw the aftermath of it. And there were a couple of historians who were on the council with me who worked minor miracles to right the ship at that time. I mean, there were people like the Cannons, Brian Cannon and his dad, Don Cannon, and the late Dean May, and others who worked a lot and very hard. Larry King and his wife Elaine, who were the co-executive directors, who came on board about that time, contributed mightily also. Then some of those problems reappeared around 2008, 2009, and work had to be done to fix that. So most members of MHA don't realize that, and probably shouldn't. I mean, it's the council and then its successor organization, the board, felt that the fixes needed to be done, but needed to be done in private rather than publicly. So they just did what needed to be done. So that's what I spent most of my time on, Denny, not grand historical theory issues. It was, I have a story which I won't give you the long version of, but one of my classmates at college later became the president of Yale. His name was A. Bartlett Giamatti, Bart Giamatti. He was the father of Paul Giamatti, the actor. And after he left the presidency at Yale, Bart Giamatti became the president of first the National Baseball League and then the whole Major League Baseball operation. But when he was president of the university, I would go see him when I was there to try to recruit engineers for General Motors, where I was working at the time. And I'd drop in to see him and ask him how it was going. And one day he said, I don't know how it's going, Bill. He said, I'm scared to death that I'm going to go down in history as not the president who did grand things in the theory of university administration or Renaissance literature, which was his specialty. But I'm going to go down as the guy who spent his tour of duty as president of Yale fixing slate roofs, digging telephone trenches, and bailing out leaky basements, because that's what I'm spending all my time on. He said, and I'm scared to death that's going to be my legacy. Well, it turned out that wasn't. He did a lot more than that. But that's the feeling I had, as president of MHA. It was the pick and shovel stuff, fixing the roof, rather than the theoretical foundations of rethinking doctrines and covenants or something of that sort. So that was that's in a nutshell my tenure as president of MHA. When I left it, when I turned it over to Richard Jensen in May of 2011, my wife and I left St. George, where that conference was, and went back home to Santa Barbara. And then a couple of days later, we flew out to the Adirondacks in northern New York State, where we had both spent summers in the late 40s and early 50s. And we spent a week or two in a boathouse on the west shore of Lake George, this beautiful 35-mile long, pristine Adirondack lake that you can still drink out of. Thomas Jefferson visited in the 1790s. I mean, it was the gem of the Eastern Seaboard. And it was only when we got there, and I would get up early in the morning in this boathouse and stare out at the lake that I'd paddled up the length of as a kid in 1949 and 50, and look at 5 miles across the lake, and I could see the mountains I used to climb as a kid. And that's what kind of settled me down after 2 or 3 years of nonstop disaster in the making. So that was part of my legacy at MHA, which I did not realize was going to be the case when Kathy Danes called up and asked me if I'd stand for election. I said, "Oh, okay, fine." I mean, I didn't think it was going to be just a ceremonial job like cutting ribbons and opening supermarkets or like the president of France or something of that sort. But I had no idea that there was going to be that kind of stress and amount of work. So it's not very exciting, but that's what my 3-year tour of duty as prospective president, and past president turned out to be.
Sounds like they got a person in there that had the right skills that what they needed and experience. So sounds like they were lucky to have you.
Well, it was quite an experience. I mean, interesting to me, none of my successors have ever called up to ask kind of, what did you learn out of all that? Or what advice do you have? Or do you think there's something we ought to be doing differently now? You're not on the board any longer, but does anything come to mind that we ought to think about? Or I mean, absolutely nothing. You're one of the few people that's ever asked me about my experience as MHA president. It's a little bit like writing my first article and not hearing from anybody who's read it for 20 years. I mean,
Hopefully it's been shorter than 20 years since I've asked you the question.
well, that's true. Oh,
Uh,
well.
well, oh my goodness, I just have been so overwhelmed with all the things you've shared with me. So over all these years, 65 years, you said.
Well, yeah, I started in 1958.
So how has this research impacted what you're doing now? I mean, has your research focus shifted? Are you still focused on the Utah War? Tell us how that you started out with Utah War. Now, where are
Yeah,
you?
right. Well, I'm still working on aspects of it, Denny. The Utah War was so complicated. There were so many people involved in it. The sweep of it that I described earlier when we talked about the word extensive as well as expensive. There was so much of it that there's just tons of material that ended up on the cutting room floor. I mean, that Source Point started off as a single volume. And when I got into it after a year or two, I realized that, oh, there's way more stuff than I can fit under one cover. So I talked to Will Bagley, who was my general editor, and Bob Clark, who was the publisher, about broadening it to a 2-volume study. And they thought about it and they said, okay, yeah, we'll go for that. And then at one point I sort of half in jest raised the question of a 3rd volume, and that freaked them out, and they told me to cease and desist and get on with the 2nd volume. So but there was a lot of material that I had that I couldn't use just because of space limitations. And much of that I've turned into articles, and I'm still working on some. I mean, I'm now juggling another book and 4 other articles. And that was the case 2 years ago, too. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of it. The thing that's a little different, this is to your point, some of it is only tangentially Utah War related, or some of it has no relationship to the Utah War at all. But it's all Western. All of it is about the American West. So in I'd say the last 5 or 6 years, I've been spending a lot of time on overland trail issues. Now, in some cases, that relates to the Utah War. Like Ken Alford at BYU faculty and I edited a book that came out just this past March called On the Overland Trails with William Clark, a Teamsters Utah War. And that's about a young guy named Bill Clark who worked his way west. He was a gold rusher to California, but he worked his way west as a Teamster with Russell Majors and Waddell, the freighters for the Utah expedition. It wasn't really about the campaign itself. It was about moving animals and freight across the trail and the people that he ran into. I mean, murderers, thieves, PhDs. I mean, unbelievably colorful story, but not primarily about Utah and not primarily about Mormons, but some of that. And there were a number of things like that. I mean, there was, I did an essay earlier in the year about a Yale alumnus, class of 1846, named Lorenzo Wesson from Chillicothe, Ohio, who became a gold rusher after he graduated from Yale. And after he panned for gold in Colorado, in California, he went to Colorado for the Pikes Peak gold rush. And in the course of that, running out of money, he spent his time hunting for frogs in the streams that ran through the Great Plains near the Santa Fe Trail. So he's out there in the middle of the most fierce Indian tribes in North America on a white mule with an antique rifle all by himself, hunting frogs up to his waist in water along the Santa Fe Trail. And the frogs that he caught, he would take to army garrisons or campsites and sell to the soldiers, who would then, have frogs' legs for dinner. I mean, if they ran out of or got tired of antelope or buffalo or whatever, then some of Lorenzo Wesson's frogs' legs were just dandy. And so they kept him busy for a couple of years. And one of the lieutenants at a cavalry regiment he sold frogs' legs to wrote his parents in New Jersey about this extraordinary guy they ran into at a bivouac on the Santa Fe Trail. And he describes Lorenzo Wesson and, hey, this guy went to Yale and look what he's doing now. And it's a wonderful description of Wesson that isn't available anywhere else. Yale knows only that he was there and graduated in 1846. University doesn't know anything about what happened to him when he left New Haven, Connecticut. But yet in these letters written to parents in New Jersey, a cavalry lieutenant records the man they came to call the Frog Man. A lot of people didn't know what Lorenzo Wesson's real name was, so they called him the Frog Man. But I mean, that's a case of a story that has nothing to do with Latter-day Saints, but it's certainly a story about the West and
Yes.
who was out there from a variety of backgrounds.
So you've made the Frogman come to life.
The Frogman lives, right? Lorenzo Wesson.
Oh my goodness.
I'd love to find a photograph of the guy. I mean, I've built up this picture of what he must look like, but I mean, he was really in the middle of fierce Indian warfare, and I think the Indians left him alone because he was so eccentric, and some of the tribes had a certain reverence or respect for extreme oddity and eccentricity and real mental illness that prompted them to kind of plow around those people instead of savaging them. They gave him a pass, and he survived all that.
Well, so that's taken you down some interesting roads, your initial research that you
Interesting roads and more than a few rabbit holes, Denny.
What about you? How has all of this research impacted you personally? Has it changed your life?
Yeah, it has. I mean, it's given me it's very different than the thing I did. My two other careers ran to business, 25 years with General Motors and a lot of years after that as a management consultant running my own firm. And then public service is the third career, which involved chairing Children's Hospital of Michigan and serving in the Air Force and serving on the boards of a couple of universities and school boards. I mean, so the research and writing I've done is very different than all of that other stuff I was doing simultaneously, and so I think it's helped me, keep a balance of sorts as opposed to just fixing it on one thing, and it's broadened me in the sense that I now have a better understanding of the country. I started off in upstate New York, and here I am in coastal California. I guess last stop because I don't plan to spend much time in Hawaii. Um, so there's been a change because of that, and I've met some fantastic people along the way. A lot of them in MHA. So those have been changes too. I mean, so I've come across because of the interest in history and the interactions with historical organizations like the Mormon History Association and OCTA, the Oregon California Trails Association. I've met a lot of wonderful people, interesting, colorful people who become lifelong friends. So that's been a change that's come out of all this.
What about, no, go ahead. You said, I mean, what?
Well, I mean, the other activities I've been in, have produced a lot of interesting experiences and friendships too. But the ones related to history in the West have been different. And in the course of it, I've become a Westerner. I mean, I now, as I said, live in California, not upstate New York any longer. I lived in Michigan for a long time too, and I still go back to northern Michigan occasionally in the summer when the weather's good. But being in the West, I think probably came out of much of that activity. I mean, I first saw the West in the summer of 1953 when I camped on the Irvine Ranch in Orange County, California. I went out there with the Boy Scouts before the Irvine family sold the ranch. There was no town of Irvine there, no university, just a sea of grass down to the Pacific. That was the first time I'd ever seen anything west of Chicago. But I think it was the thing that really led to moving out here in 2007 was the cumulative sense of interest and comfort and color in the West that came from the study of it and the people I met in it.
Yeah.
That's a life changer.
I've grown up in Utah. I moved away from Utah for 45 years. Now I'm back in Utah, and there is definitely something about the West. It's very different.
Yeah,
It's fun. It's young compared to back east, and just different history, fun history out here. So I can relate to that.
Well, I met you and Kevin through all of this, right?
Yes. Well, you talked about a professor that put you on the path to go look up something in the archives, but are you mentoring anybody in a young historian or
Well,
this point?
I don't use the word mentor a whole lot. I mean, for me, it's a little self-conscious, but I've got friends and people I spend time with that like it. I suppose some of those are proteges, but there are a fair number of those people. I mean, I think in some ways, even though I learned a lot from Artist Partial and Will Bagley, to a certain extent, I think they took away with something from the experience too. I think they learned some things from me that they wouldn't have otherwise. There are other younger historians like Brent Rogers, for example, who's one of the archivists at Church History, is running a lot of good history, and I've just written a review of his latest book that's coming out in Kansas, the Journal of the Central Plains, in next month. His book is it's called Buffalo Bill Cody and the Mormons. about how Bill Cody changed from being anti-Mormon in the 1860s and 70s to being very close to the church and helping it settle the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming in the 1890s and early 1900s. That's what Brent's book is about. So I've written a review of it for Kansas History.
What kind of advice would you give to young historians, those coming up through the ranks? You've learned a lot.
I'd ask a lot of questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Approach and stay in touch with the people who are doing work that you admire and that you like, instead of just reading it and saying, gee, that was a great article, and going on to the next thing. I mean, get a hold of who did that and tell them what you thought of it. Or if you've got questions, or if you hated it, tell them that too. But stay in touch with people in the field, and don't be afraid to approach them. I mean, I made a big mistake in Battalion when I was an undergraduate. I majored in history, but also they didn't call it a minor, but it was the equivalent of a minor in American literature. So I read a lot of novels, and one that I really liked more than any other was Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. He'd written it about a fictive governor of Louisiana in the 1920s and 1930s who was really a stand-in for Huey Long. Robert Penn Warren was teaching on the faculty of Louisiana State in Baton Rouge when 500 yards away, Huey Long was assassinated in the rotunda of the state capitol in 1935. And he then wrote All the King's Men about some of those experiences, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. And the next year, the movie that was made from it won the Academy Award for Best Film. And when I read it in the late 1950s, I thought it was a terrific book. Well, at that point, Robert Penn Warren was teaching at Yale. His office was 50 yards from my dorm room. But as a 19-year-old, I was too inhibited or stupid to go over and knock on his office door, introduce myself, and say, how about going over to the Yankee Doodle for a hamburger? I mean, I didn't do that. But I wrote him 20 years later, and I sent him a copy of a term paper I'd written in the late 50s about his novel, All the King's Men. And I got this wonderful hand-typed letter back from him commenting on my 20-year-old term paper about his book. And the typing was awful, but the generosity of his comments, were one of the high points of that year. So my advice is don't do what I did, which is to do nothing but, read a man's work and think about how great it was, but never tell them that, or never ask them any questions, because people are approachable, though they're unbelievably generous in answering questions or giving your tips or pointers. So that's one piece of advice. The other is don't underestimate the power of serendipity in your research. I'm sorry, I'm trying to turn off the phone. Serendipity is different than dumb luck. It's the prepared mind seeing connections and linkages that otherwise wouldn't be the case. Again, this is not taught in graduate school anywhere as a methodology or a tool. But if you keep your wits about you and you ask enough questions and you think about things that you see instead of just passing them by, all kinds of good things can come out of that process. I've likened it to my old Air Force radar squadron, which for a while was in Germany, controlling traffic in and out of Berlin. And if the squadron's equipment was the right stuff, the height finder and the search range radars, and it was pointed in the right direction. And the radar operator was a person who had the right skills and training and motivation. And if that operator turned the switch to turn the antenna on, you'd pick up things. And you'd pick up things that other people wouldn't. Like, is that a MiG-21 in an air corridor going into Berlin that shouldn't be there? Or what about that squadron that just landed on a Czech airfield from Russia? I mean, is that supposed to be there, and why is it there? I mean, is that a flock of Canada geese on the scope, or is that a C-123? I mean, if you've got the right people with the right equipment used in the right way, things will happen. And it's that way with historical research. If you make linkages and connections and ask questions. I mean, Jack London has made some fascinating comments about that process, about how that helped him write his novels. Branch Rickey, the baseball executive, comments about the value of serendipity in terms of running a baseball club. Robert B. Parker, who wrote the Spencer novels, in his last Spencer novel has the Boston private detective Spencer explain his methodology for being a detective. And it's basically going out and shaking the bushes and seeing what falls out and what the meaning of it all is. I mean, he has a long discussion in his last novel about how a private eye goes about being a private eye. I mean, being a historical researcher is a little bit like that. So don't underestimate the power of that kind of behavior, but cultivate it and use it. I can't tell you how many discoveries I've made and things I've come across partly because of that. For example, let's go back to the British ambassador to Washington, who was drinking tumblers of old Monongahela and smoking cigars in the Lincoln bedroom with James Buchanan, and then writing about it for his foreign minister in London. The only reason I became aware that those documents existed was in reading a rare book catalog one day. I came across, offered for sale, a book for $30 that had been published 10 years earlier, written by a couple in Indiana, a faculty couple on a university staff. And the title of the book was Dispatches of British Diplomats in Washington to the Foreign Ministry, 1840 through 1885, or something like that. And I looked at the title of the book and I figured, geez, I wonder if there's anything in there about 1857. So I borrowed the book on interlibrary loan. And there, in the section dealing with 1857, it's got a summary of 6 dispatches written by this ambassador I was talking about back to London. I had no idea they existed. So I called up the historians who had written the book and talked to them a little bit about, well, where are the originals for these things? Because they only published excerpts for some of them. And they told me, and it turned out they were in Oxford, at Oxford University's library. I never would have been aware of that if I hadn't reacted in that way to a catalog entry in a rare book dealer's catalog describing that particular volume along with 108 other titles that he was offering for sale. It's an example of how things can click and lead from one thing to another. I mean, that affects your life too. I have this incredible daisy chain of incidents and associations that eventually led to my marrying Pat, my wife. I was a widower when I first met her, but the chain of events by which we met is as long as your arm, but it's full of those kinds of connections. And if I hadn't pursued some of them, nothing would have happened. I never would have met her. Ken Alford at BYU and I published an article in Utah Historical Quarterly in 2021 about a document in the Yale collection of Western Americana that was purchased for $10 from a rare book dealer by the curator around 1972. And the document was a 2-page light blue lined stationery letter, all written in code. The curator at Yale bought it on sort of a whim. The only thing that was written in plain text that you could understand was at the top. It said July 21, 1858, Salt Lake City. Everything else was in gibberish. Exactly why he bought it, I don't know, but he bought it and it went into a folder of uncatalogued items. So in the fall of 2020, his successor, the guy who replaced him in 1981 when he retired, in 2020 called me up and we talked about something going on in his collection. And then he paused and he said, well, something came in the other day that we just got around to cataloging, you might be interested in. And he described this item. He said, I don't know why Archie bought it in 1972, and I don't know what it is, Bill, but this sounds like the kind of thing you're interested in. Well, I said, I am, because the date July 21, 1858 in Salt Lake City is very relevant, and no one would go to the effort of encrypting, coding a letter that long and that complicated unless it was important. And the only thing important going on at that time in Salt Lake City was the arrival of the U.S. Army in the Utah War. So it must be important, but I don't know what it is either. So I chatted up Artis, who Artis happens to be an authority on Latter-day Saint use of codes over the years, sent it to her by email. She didn't know what it was, but she said, I know somebody on the math faculty at BYU and he understands codes. Maybe he can figure out what it is. Well, he couldn't. So I stewed with that for a couple of weeks. Then I remembered my pal Ken Alford on the BYU faculty had been in the Army for 30 years. And I figured, gee, he must know somebody in the crypto world in the Army. Maybe they can help. So I sent it to Ken and we chatted. He said, I don't know anybody any longer that's in crypto work, but I do know that the national director of the National Security Museum in Washington, and they've got all kinds of cryptographic machines from World War II and things of that sort. Maybe he can help. So I said, go to it. So he chats up his old buddy at the National Crypto Museum in Washington, and he's stumped too, but he says, I have a friend in Washington, in Germany, who's the ace civilian crypto expert. So he sent it to that guy, and it turned out he was having a conference in 2 days of fellow crypto enthusiasts all across Europe. So he put this 2-page baby blue letter in code up before that group, and a couple of the people at the conference, one working at a university in Scotland and the other one at a university in Wales, I think, solved it within a month. And it turned out it was an encrypted letter written by Brigham Young to Thomas L. Kane, sent east by hand courier to Pennsylvania, and Elizabeth Kane decoded the message. Where the decoded version went, I don't know, but the coded original gravitated to the Yale collection of Western Americana in 1972 through this fortuitous $10 purchase by a very curious archivist who had no idea what he was going to do with it except put it in a file folder. Well, think of the linkages, how many different people were involved and connected that finally produced the answer to what is this and what does it mean? And we were able to answer those questions after this very long period of time and this very long daisy chain of connections, questions, and interventions to answer what was it and what did it mean.
That's incredible.
So that's what, and Holly George, as an editor at Utah Historical Quarterly, is she has a very broad streak of curiosity that runs through her life too. And that's the kind of thing she just loves. I mean, a lot of editors would look at that and say, what on earth do we want to do anything with this for? I mean, we're not a journal of cryptology. We do Utah history. But that's not what Holly did. She encouraged us to turn this into an article, which we did.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up that story because that is one of my personal goals with these interviews is to let people hear how people have used different talents and interests to bring different aspects and perspectives to the stories that we're hearing in this time period. And here's one that I never would have thought of. Somebody who has talent and knowledge and expertise in cryptology, right? Here
Yeah.
you are helping decipher what happened way back
The,
years
the, the
ago.
two guys that broke this code, by the way, had no idea. Once they were able to turn the crypto version into plain text English, they had no idea what it meant. They didn't know who Brigham Young was. They didn't know who Thomas L. Kane was. They didn't know what went on in Utah. All they were doing was trying to render this gibberish into English, which they did. But they didn't have any insight or understanding of what it was. I mean, but they were perfectly happy to do it as a game. I mean, this is intellectual grist for their mill. They love that kind of stuff, and so they went to it and accomplished what we had hoped they would. And they were happy to turn it over to us, but didn't
Wow,
really understand what it was.
that is incredible. Kind of like the hackers conference where they try to hack into things.
Yeah, right. It's that mentality. Although I think these people are a cut above that.
Well, one of the things that just as we get ready to close here, one of the things you mentioned to me was there are a lot of unanswered questions about the Utah War that you still think people have an opportunity to try to dig out and find. One has to do with Jefferson Hunt, you said. Do you want to expound on that a bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not aware that anybody else has raised this question, but it's been on my mind. I mean, uh, Jefferson Hunt was one of the uh, principal Mormon officers of the Mormon Battalion. I think he was a company commander, one of the 4 or 5 companies in the battalion, and he stayed in California after the unit was discharged and uh, went back and forth from California to Utah, but spent a lot of time in California. And by the 1850s, he was a major general in the California State Militia, and uh, very active in the development of San Bernardino and things like that. But he doesn't show up in the Utah War. He came back to Utah finally when the Utah War started, and they rolled up the LDS community in San Bernardino, and most of those people came back to Utah. Hunt was in Utah, but I haven't found any record of military activity or use on his part at all. Uh, and I often wondered the why of it. I mean, here's a guy who was one of the more senior Mormon leaders in the Mormon Battalion, a major figure in the California State Militia, and here his church and his people are involved in a major confrontation of a military character with the U.S. Army, and he's sort of around, but no one's using him. And I've wondered the why of it. Before he died, I asked Tom Sutak, who was sort of the country's leading authority on Jefferson Hunt. I asked him the why question. He didn't know. He had no idea. So for me, it's an unanswered question. Was there a personality clash between Brigham Young and Jefferson Hunt? I'm not aware of any. It wasn't like the conflict between Brigham Young and C.C. Rich, for example. Nothing that I could see that it would explain his disengagement from the scene. I mean, I would have thought he would have been almost at the head of the Nauvoo Legion, uh, helping to fend off the army, but not so. So anyway, that's an unanswered question. I discovered later in someone's diary that after the War was over, Hunt had gone to Washington because he'd never been there before, and he stopped by the White House, just popped in, no appointment or anything like that, and got to see President Buchanan, as was possible at that time. I mean, people used to do it with Lincoln all the time. I mean, because the staff consisted of an usher or doorkeeper and a cook and a coachman, and that was about it. So people just wandered in and stood in line and got to see the president, and that's what Jefferson Hunt did. And I've often wondered what was all that about. And the diary entry that I read implied that there was some discussion about the Utah War, and I wonder what was that. And you know, I think the record indicated he had reported this to Brigham Young, but I couldn't find it in any of Brigham Young's office journals, for example. Anyway, that's an example of an unanswered question. What, why was Jefferson Hunt, with all that experience and background, starting with the Mormon Battalion, absent without leave or with leave during the Utah War that followed? There are other questions like that. One of my favorite missing documents was also one of Bagley's favorites. It used to drive him nuts that he couldn't find it. And so, you know, he drove me nuts too after a while, but I'm still looking for it. But anyway, the document I'm referring to is in March of 1858, as Thomas L. Kane was leaving Salt Lake City to go to Fort Bridger to try to convince the Army to be careful about how they entered the Salt Lake Valley. Just before he left Salt Lake City to go to Fort Bridger, he spent some time with Wilford Woodruff. And Woodruff recorded in his diary that he gave Kane a 6-page handwritten memorandum summarizing where the Mormons were in the war effort and why they were taking the positions they were and whatnot. I mean, Wilford Woodruff was then the assistant church historian. I don't quite remember whether he was one of the 12 apostles at that point or not, probably not. But of course, he became Brigham Young's successor after John Taylor. But Bagley was vexed that he couldn't find that document anywhere. I mean, in all the Kane papers that were bought by BYU and are in other collections, Kane stuff is strewn through 7 different historical societies and universities that I know of. No sign of this document at all. And we often wonder what the heck happened to it. Why is it missing? What did it say? So that's one of the things I call the missing also. There are dozens of things like that, Denny, that, you know, maybe I have an overactive imagination, but they're on my radar, parked off to one side. They're on the radar, but haven't yielded any results yet.
Maybe someone will hear this and want to take it on as a quest of their own. That would be fun.
That would be terrific. I'd love to have somebody find it. I mean, so there, as I say, there are lots of things like that either are inexplicable or we know exist but can't find, like the 6-pager Wilford Woodruff hand wrote and gave to Thomas L. Kane.
Well, you could just go on for years and years and checking all these things out.
I'm counting on it.
And I hope so too, because it sounds like you've turned up some really fun things. Very interesting. And it's just been great to have a chance today to visit with you. Before we close off, is there anything else that's come to mind that you think would be good for us to capture?
Another open-ended question. I mean, who knows with that one? Right? Let me just look at my notes.
Great. And while you're looking at
You,
your
at
slide,
one point, when we talked a couple of months ago about doing this, um, you you asked me, is there anything about all this that's funny or
oh,
fun?
yes.
I mean, the the fun part, of course, comes from the finding things unexpectedly and also meeting colorful people. I mean, that's the fun part. But the funny part, there have been incidents. One of them was, I thought about this. I was with you and Denny and some of the Mormon Battalion folk years ago
Me
on
and
a
Kevin.
Kevin.
Me and Kevin.
What did I? Whose name did I use?
You said me and Denny. People do that all the
Oh,
time.
you're Denny. Yeah. I was with you, Denny, and Kevin, your husband, on a brilliant October fall day in Detroit's Elmwood Cemetery. And the reason we were there was that Kevin was quarterbacking a ceremony honoring Philip St. George Cook, the commander of the Mormon Battalion, who's buried in Detroit's Elmwood Cemetery. Cook's last military assignment was as commander of the Department of the Lakes, the Great Lakes, with headquarters in Detroit. And he passed away there in the 1890s. And he's buried with his wife in Elmwood Cemetery, which is this large wooded tract, beautiful piece of property, loaded with Victorian sculpture, headstones, and monuments. I mean, it's like something out of almost like a Charles Addams cartoon. I mean, just all this elaborately carved Gothic stuff. And then we had a couple of presentations and readings in the little chapel about 20 yards from Colonel Cook's grave that Denny was also responsible. I mean, that Kevin was responsible for arranging. Well, I got to chuckling halfway through the ceremony because I remembered that the last time I'd been in Elmwood Cemetery a couple years before was with Will Bagley, and Bagley was out to visit me about the project that became At Swords Point. And while we were there, he said, "Say, Philip St. George Cook is buried somewhere here in Detroit. Can we go see the grave?" I said, "Well, I don't know quite where it is, Will. I think it's Elmwood Cemetery, but I don't know where." And so he said, "Well, let's go down there and we'll get a map or something like that." So we went down there and we badgered the sexton of Elmwood Cemetery, and he gave us a map and showed us where the grave was. And we're thrashing around in this beautiful rolling wooded Victorian cemetery, and we finally found the grave, and the original stones had been replaced, and the two new ones, which I think the Army paid for, were flush on the ground. They weren't standing. They hadn't fallen over. They were just set in the ground and were engraved with the names and dates of Philip St. George Cook and his wife. At this point, it's getting very late in the afternoon, and the shadows are lengthening. And Will says, "Oh, I found it." And I went over, and these gravestones are just covered with oak leaves and twigs and branches, and it's a mess. We have no tools at all. We couldn't read the inscription, so he starts clawing at this debris on top of the gravestones, to brush it off, and he's urging me to help him. And so we're like two madmen trying to clean off this gravesite so we can read what it says about Philip St. George Cook and his wife. And by this time, it's really getting late. And I figured, well, this place closes in about 10 minutes, and I don't want to get locked in here, not in this place with you. So we finally succeeded, and I think he took a photograph or two of the headstones, and we ran for the gates just as they were about to get locked up for the night. I mean, well, it wasn't so funny at the time, but in retrospect, it was very comedic because Bagley was capable of being comedic when he wasn't setting about to enrage people. It was a funny experience, and it came back to me just in the middle of the service that Kevin and the Mormon Battalion reenactors were conducting to honor old Philip St. George Cook, who last time I saw was covered with oak leaves and broken branches and twigs as the shadows lengthened in spooky old Elmwood Cemetery. that was one of the funnier experiences that I had.
You get yourself in some strange situations as you try to visit historical places and get information, don't you?
Yes, yeah.
Well, anything else?
I think you probably got more than you need.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, good luck with your project, and I hope the grant comes through.
Well, we
If they know what they're doing, they'll say okay.
well, they've said okay, so now it's just up to me to deliver. And thanks to all of you, we're gonna deliver fine, I think. I just
Good.
need to thank you again and remind everybody that this project is made possible through the Oral History Grant from Utah Humanities, the Utah Historical Society, and funding from the National Mormon Trails Association and the Mormon Battalion Association.
You're in good company.